people know, but Jacob, do you want to say any nice words about Denis before we get started? Or any not nice words, whichever you prefer.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a tough question for Jacob starting.
Yes, it is, because Denis actually presented on all our camps, right, Denis? I don't remember you missing even one. And what I would say, it's always a pleasure because to listen to Denis, because he always makes it a little special and more. Like a few months ago, he with Dr. Jones verbally did presentation about decision management and how would Machiavelli will use decision management. You can find this on our monthly sessions recordings. And today, Denis will talk, he starts with very interesting things. What is the name? That's certainly one of the most important questions in decision modeling. And I want to add this, Denis is a founder and CEO and CTO of Trisotech, and this is a company that probably follows DMN, CMNN, BPN standards as close as anybody else, or maybe even better. And when you look on the improvements in the last few years, it's extremely impressive. And saying this, Denis, take over. Good luck.
Thank you for a kind word, Jacob. Good day, everyone. I'm Denis Gagne, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the work of one of my colleagues, Dr. John Svibberly, who's the Chief Medical Informatic Officer at Trisotech, who contributed a lot to this material. So hopefully today I won't open too many old wounds or get people to scratch their head too much, what I'd like to do today is try to take you on a journey to try to make DMN models truly semantically interchangeable. And I guess I'm going to take a very iterative approach to this presentation so that we step through this together and see where it takes us. I'm assuming prior knowledge of DMN, the decision model and notation from the object management group. But I'll try to make this as clear as possible to everybody watching. So what's in the name? The famous Shakespeare quote. My Shakespeare knowledge is very shallow, so don't take me on this. But this quote is often used to show the fact that the name of things don't necessarily always affect or reflect what they really are. And that's basically the core of what I want to talk about today. So let's start with this. In DMN, what does this mean? What does this diagram mean? So we know that it depicts decision as square boxes, and it depicts inputs as ovals. And then we have information requirement that are these links between them. But what's great about standards like DMN, which is the decision model and notation, here I'm going to put an emphasis on the model side, is that because this is a model, it provides us also structural and relational semantics, so part of the behavior. So when I look at this model, and if I, excuse me for this, I can actually run the behavior of this model, and you see that it expects all my inputs to be available, and then as soon as this decision is made, then I can make this decision, and as soon as this decision is made, then I can make both other decisions. So the diagram gives us already a good sense of behavior. So without any more information in there, I have a sense of structure and behavior, what is needed to move around and what that means to a certain structural and behavioral level. Now, what if I start adding label to this diagram? So now I can read this a little bit more intelligently if you want. I know that to make decision A and decision B, I need as an input the result of decision C. And to make decision C, I need as an input A, B, B, C, C, and the result of decision D, etc., etc. So I can now maybe talk a little bit more eloquently, if you want, rather than say this box and that box by pointing at it. I can name the decision, I can name the input, and it will guide me a little bit more, further. But the question is, have we really gained much more from an interpretation of this decision model? Now, what if I add logic? So let me skip again and come to this. So I have this decision, and what if I add the logic, and I can actually run this logic? Now it has all the logic I have, you know, for each of my decision. So for this particular decision, I have a decision table, and for my different decision, I have here, I've just made decision table, and I can actually exercise this logic and, you know, say different values in there and run it. So I've gained some explanation, if you want. And basically now this model is logically executable. That is, that now this will semantically show a behavior based on the logic that I've provided for each of the decision. But that doesn't tell me much. I mean, now I have, you know, these same labels, arbitrary labels with some logic. And as I know, an astute observer will notice that this is a scoring pattern. So one could assume that higher up decision may be categorization pattern, but I divert. But again, we're progressing into what this means. Now, what if I add more meaningful label to this? That basically this decision is an hypotension decision that requires the systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure. And this central decision here is a curve 65 score. We were astute at noticing that this was a score before. And it's asking about new onset of confusion or reduced consciousness, blood urea, respiratory rate, age, and then will tell me a severity of pneumonia and a site of care. So now we know, or we can guess, that this is a decision model related to healthcare. But without any domain knowledge, I still don't really get it. I mean, yeah, severity of pneumonia is telling me something, site of care, curve 65 scores a little bit, and if you're like me, blood urea, etc. So again, I did gain some knowledge now, but not all that much. And what if I add the logic to this? And then in this particular case, it's exactly the same logic as what I was showing before with the arbitrary labels, except now I'm using more meaningful name, but they're exactly the same domain of values and everything for it. But now it makes more sense, and then I can have some kind of understanding of what this model is about. So basically, as you can tell, my topic today is all around the elephant in the room, which is ambiguity. And the fact that without definition and deep meaning, it's hard to really understand what these DMN models really mean. So, you know, ambiguity, as I can detect some ambiguity in this DMN model. So the question I'm posing here is, are labels enough? So some of the problems, you know, within a domain is different terms may have the same meanings, or between different domains, we can have the same term with different meaning. So talking of synonyms. And so there's the list of these can belong, as you know, with language and all these can lead to ambiguity. So what about if we start introducing control vocabularies, or sometimes often referred as business vocabularies? Then our DMN models, I would basically state that should use defined terms, and these terms should be defined in a control vocabulary to increase the quality of our model. And by increasing the quality, I mean making them more specific and understandable, providing us naming across model that is consistent, and definition of terms that are basically known. So here I am introducing basically a control vocabulary with the terms that I'm using in my model, with some definition of these terms to help us. So now blood urea, I have an actual definition of what it means, and I have a definition of what curve 65 score means in terms of its definition. So now, what if I add this right within my model? Then I can actually go into the model, and I can, have in context definition of these terms that help me hopefully better understand what this model is about. So now I know what curve 65 is. Curve 65, it's a guideline to identify patients with severe community-acquired pneumonia. And basically, curve 65 is a version of the curve score that adds a parameter about age that is greater than 65. So now I know what it is, but what does it mean? And if you are like me, I have a very shallow medical knowledge. Yeah, I have an idea of systolic blood pressure, but curve 65 is a little bit far from me. So is adding control vocabulary enough is what I'm asking here. Now that I've added the vocabulary, I have a better sense of what this is all about. But the vocabularies need to be meaningful. And to be meaningful, these vocabulary have to be in a meaningful context with relational understanding and some critical features added to them. So I'm going to take a little bit of a sidetrack here in my story. So take that as a side box about healthcare specific. So in the domain of healthcare, there's a lot of ontology-based terminologies. And basically, if we look at our model, I can then look at what the definition of confusion is within my context, within the control vocabulary that I've used for that model, is the state of being bewildered or unclear in one's mind about something. Okay, fine. But how do I use this definition to recognize that if I'm a doctor or if I'm a nurse, I'm a practitioner, a provider, how do I use this to recognize it? Or how do I match this in various conversation or in different information system? And healthcare has worked a lot on that for many years. A lot can be said about healthcare information system in general, but one side that they're really ahead of the curve is the use of ontologies. And basically, they've been used a lot for capturing and standardizing in a very granular manner the terminology used in healthcare with the goal of quality and patient safety. And these ontologies normally provide a term synonyms and different codes and the relational information. But with the years, the benefit of that kind of got happy triggering, and there's a lot of these coding systems. So there's the loan code that describe tests and measurements and observation, the RX norm code about prescription and medication, the SNOMED code about symptom diagnosis, procedures, etc. And then you have the ICD-10, which is about diagnosis. And so we come up with all these ontologies that are existing with a lot of overlap and maybe a little bit difference into the terminology and their meaning. So we can introduce in our model and take our term confusion and specifically say, well, when we say the term confusion, this is the definition we use. And for a deeper meaning based on the medical ontologies, we're equating this to the SNOMED with this particular code, which is an altered mental status finding. So now I have a code, a single identifier that I can find in an information system. And when I'm having conversation with other people, I can validate that do they really mean the same meaning as SNOMED does for this particular term. Now, there's actually, coding is a big thing in healthcare, and there's actually a profession that is about coding. And as you can imagine, in the state of healthcare right now, a lot of everything is just written notes and paper. I just had the pleasure to be in a hospital not too long ago, and my bed was near enough to the nurse station, and I could hear fax coming in all day and all night long. Yes, fax is the major way of exchanging information in the healthcare system. So you have people then that takes all these traces of natural language or doctors' diagnoses that are in natural language and actually code these so they can be put into a system a posteriori, which defeats a little bit of our purpose, but certainly not where we're going here. But even as you do that, how do you deal with the notion of abstraction, granularity, and generalization? So while the code may disambiguate the term, it may cause a loss of resolution. You know, you may lose more context in there, and you reduce something that may be very complex, like a disease, to a single code. So healthcare said, we have the solution for that, and enters the notion of value sets. And value sets are basically sets of code taken from one or many different coding systems that are intended in a particular context to broaden the meaning. So applying this to our confusion here, I've searched a value set for confusion and expanded this value set, and now you can see that I have a various number of codes from different coding systems, and their display label, which I can dig into the ontology, and that broadens my notion of confusion within my model to things that are maybe a little bit, you know, disorientation in time, acute confusion, clouded consciousness. So now I've broadened my meaning of confusion. So that was my side box in healthcare, given that I was using a healthcare example here. And that was a bit purposely because I'm assuming most people don't necessarily have the deep healthcare knowledge. I certainly don't, so I expect everybody is like me. Now, what about concept models? What if I could introduce concept models into the game? So a concept model is a set of basically concept with their relation. The terms represent the concept here, and the noun concepts are associated via verb concept to give me a little bit more context into understanding my terms and their definition. And these here are depicted as box and arrows, and I didn't write it out, but this is a relationship, and this is a name relationship there. And then I can have a better, grander understanding of the terms within that context. And here, I guess Ron Ross will be very happy for me to call this out. I'm talking about semantics here, not data. We're really trying to understand these terms from I'll use the term business, although it's more topic related, because here at healthcare, most healthcare people don't like to think of their profession as a business. So here I'm really talking about semantics. Now, what if I add this concept model to my Curve 65 environment? Now, suddenly, I have a definition of curve 65. I know that is a score, and that is to look at the presence or the severity of community-acquired pneumonia. And here I know that it's based on confusion, on reduced consciousness, urea, respiratory rate, and hypertension, which all of these may be indication of some organ failure, a particular organ system failure, which may indicate potential death. So now I have a better understanding that when I'm looking at a curve 65 score, yes, there is the definition of what it is, but now I have an understanding of what it means, why it's important, because when taking together these different observations may be indication of potential failures in my system, in my organs, which may then lead to death, which is a very important thing to know. So now, when we put all this together, now I have my definition, I have my context, and it provides us a much better understanding of what curve 65 means. Now, the question I have is, but is adding concept model enough? Because I know what curve 65 is, I have a definition, I have some understanding of what it means within a context. I even have a logic to exercise it right now, and maybe that's the cart before the horses, but what are the rules that govern the interpretation? What are the criteria? What's allowed, what's not allowed? How do I take this? Comes in business rules. So what if I introduce these business rule here, and I have some business rule, and these are basically provided to me by a medical knowledgeable person, and tells me these are the rules. And then it explained here, this particular things explained to me how to actually calculate a curve 65 score, and how to get all this together. Now, Ron would point out to me that, these would be better rules if they were in the form of definitional or behavioral rule, capturing notion of necessity and obligation, dialectic, deontic type of rule. I won't get into that conversation today, but I have a set of rules here. So now, what does that give me by combining these rules with the definition? So now I can better understand these rules and the definition together as I'm going to this. So I can have now an interpretation of the score decision. And if I put it within the other rules context, then I have, what kind of care or how to react to this knowledge. But then are adding these rules enough? I just don't seem to be satisfied with anything today. So I'd like to know what are the sources. So that's great. You guys are taking me, taking this for granted. I'm telling you what curve 65 is, what its definition is, what it means in the context. I tell you how it's calculated, but on what authority, on what knowledge is that created? And that's where we introduce knowledge source and authority, which bring it all together. So now I can have my decision model with my terminology that is disambiguated. That same terminology within a context of concept model telling me what it means contextually. And now I have the authority under which these decisions are made. And these are the rules. And basically, as you can see here, I can see that the severity and the site of care is under the authority of the set of rules. The little lock here means that this is a reuse by reference. And if I click on this here, it takes me to the actual set of rules that provides the authority for these two decisions, which are these rules here. So now I have a complete understanding of the authority and, oops, excuse me. So for each of these decision here, I have the authority. For this 365 decision, I have the authority under the rules that I showed you before on how the score is made. But yet, I'm still lacking some more information and authority, which is the reference. And as you've noticed here, I have another knowledge source that is basically the references, the evidence that was used. So these different publications here are the evidence, the medical evidence, published evidence that was used to derive everything that we've seen up to now in this model. So now that I have all this in context, we'd like to generalize this to BPM plus. BPM plus here, just a moniker to reference BPMN, CMMN, and DMN, all about workflow automation and decision automation. And I won't go too deeply into that. And I would argue that all that's needed to bring all this within BPMN and CMMN is to have the capability of having knowledge source into our models and being able to have our label, as I've shown in the DMN model, that are disambiguated by a vocabulary and concept maps. And that way, we can do the same disambiguation in a BPMN model or case model in CMMN, giving us what I consider more semantically interchangeable knowledge packages. So my conclusion is that for DMN models to become truly semantically interchangeable, labels on models are not enough. We need to add control vocabularies. And control vocabularies are not enough. We need to add concept model. In there comes into play, in particular in healthcare, and other industries also have notions similar, but healthcare requires also coding, ontology-based coding. Concept models are not enough. We need business rules. Business rules are not enough. We need to add knowledge source and authority. So this is all about disambiguation. And I would generalize this that for a set of BPM plus model to become truly semantically interchangeable knowledge packages, we need to add SBVR to the mix. Sorry, this may cause some people to giggle and other people to grunt, but I really believe that we're at the point now where SBVR has to take its place within the BPM plus group. For those that don't know, SBVR is another open standard, the semantic of business vocabularies and business rules. So because we're in an AI conference, I thought I would use AI to animate my friend Shakespeare in the corner there while I'll take questions from people. And that's my presentation for today. I hope I started a good conversation in the group.
Thank you, Denis. It's you finished up like super early here, so I'm sure everybody is still formulating their questions. But I do like the animated Shakespeare on your last slide here.
Yeah, and I don't know if Brian Stuckey is in there, but before I animated him, I didn't react. But once I animated Shakespeare, it reminded me of Brian Stuckey. So.
Yes, he is here. Okay. Okay, interesting. Any questions? Denis, you just while people writing or thinking about questions, you mentioned we always talk about executable models. Some people tell that decision models should not be executable. Majority of us believe does not make sense not to execute decision model, and if it's not executable, it should not exist. This is two extreme opinions, but you mentioned something what a little bit confused me. You said logically executable model. Is it something new?
No, well, so yeah, thank you. I was hoping that Pandora's box would open. There's a few Pandora's box that I was hoping would open on this. So yes, so I didn't go and call it out, right? But fundamentally, if you take this argumentation, I was arguing that just a drawing on a napkin is pretty useless in terms of exchanging knowledge. And certainly in the context of, for example, healthcare, where you have life critical, or in the context of aircraft, where you have, again, life critical, or other contexts where you have mission critical situation, we need to pass on more than drawings on a napkin. So certainly disambiguating the terminology will help, but also specifying the logic, how the decision, the behavior, how the decision is achieved is also very important. As maybe some of you know, I believe that without feel, DMN doesn't mean much. It's just a bunch of boxes on a piece of paper. And it's when you add feel to DMN that you can really know the behavior and the execution semantic of the model. And when you add terminology and rules, that's when you have a more complete knowledge package. And I'm hoping that some of the SBVR folks that were quite present at the beginning of the DMN existence, but kind of pulled away at one point, I'm hoping they're raising their fist in the air, claiming victory here. As you can tell, what I'm doing here is a very pragmatic, loosely coupling of the rules. So rather than seeing the business rule as the actual executable elements, I'm using them as authority to the more explicit decision logic in there.
And I think that SBVR is probably something that many of us have not even thought about for a long time, because it's just it hasn't sort of come to the level of popularity that I think was originally intended. And over on Slack, Jan Purchase says that what you said needed to be said, and that you gave a great synthesis of supporting ideas, and it was well presented. Now there's a question from Matteo Mortari, who first of all says it's an awesome presentation, which I agree with. And he said he understands there are standards for vocabularies functionally, and he wonders if you see difficulties in this approach due to the closed world of some domain of knowledge, like the vocabulary is beyond, or I think inside the walls.
Yeah, well, and that's why, we're talking about control vocabularies, and the models are interpreted within these control contexts. But yes, that is the challenge. As you broaden your models, you broaden your vocabulary, you broaden your meanings. It can bring some. And the funny thing, so this presentation was short. Creating the whole set of models behind it was long. So this is not easy. So if I go here, and this particular model with all its logic, plus all the different terms and their definition, and the relations that are generated by the concept maps, and creating all the concept maps. So here, I have observation concept map and organ systems and pneumonia classifier in there, and I have the curve 65. So there's a lot of work to create such a model. So making things clearly disambiguated is a lot of work. And when you present it, it seems like pretty obvious and simple as you go over it. So the idea here is exactly that. And I'm sure everybody can see the same generalization in a BPMN model and in a CMMN model, where using knowledge source, you can disambiguate the activities and the terms or the rules in the law. I actually had a whole other model about conformance to some calculation based on the Frank Dodds regulation, and all this with the similar kind of exercise explaining, and maybe I can bring it up just because it showcased one of my favorite thing about field. So if you take this this model here, again, disambiguated in a very similar way, where I'm computing margin and all this, and this is the actual copy paste at the top of the regulation. So this is the natural language regulation on how you compute the initial margin requirement. And over each, so this is a box context using the iteration new box context to make things simpler to read. And here, for example, if you just read at that last term, initial margin, this is the natural language from the regulation, and this is the actual field expression for it. And the fact that we have field in such a rich way with spaces and all these things, we can actually have the logic. So it's very simple for a subject matter expert to go and confirm here whether the logic is properly captured in the field expression.
So Ron Ross is giving you a shout out on Slack, just saying, bravo for bringing concept models and semantics and rules to decision models and DMN, and that it doesn't really matter whether it's SBVR or not. It's a big hole in DMN in general at present. And just kind of what you've really done is sort of pointed out the piece of knowledge that's been missing in what we've had in the decision models and so on.
Yeah, and that was basically my point. And this got really motivated to us and to me by the fact that we're in the last few years, we've been dealing a lot in the healthcare environment using DMN. And there's two things that are very important, is making sure that we are exactly talking about the same thing, not assuming things. So that's very, very important. Making sure that the knowledge is precise, that the knowledge is based on evidence. So it is evidence based on what's been published, what's been researched. And we see that right now with the COVID and the vaccine and people making different kind of interpretation. But when you have an interpretation that is based on facts and data and actual definition and research, then you can provide better explanation to your decision. Plus another factor that I didn't talk about here, but in a lot of situations in healthcare, they'll like the automated decision, but they'll want to validate the inputs before they're provided to the system, and they'll want to validate the output before it's used into any action. So stepping on top of the presentation from Alan earlier, there's also this aspect of, in their particular case, which is the function of validating the input before it's used automatically and validating the output before it is used to trigger any automated action. So there's a human factor that comes back into play here.
Okay. We have a raised hand over on Zoom. So Bruce Bray, I'll call on you if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hi, Denis, a great presentation. That reminds me, I'm in healthcare, and the issue is often the how bad the data is that we have, and I think you just mentioned that from a previous presentation that we have bad data. Knowing is that BUN correct? How recent is it? Is the blood pressure correct? Sometimes you'll have a high blood pressure and a low blood pressure within minutes of each other because of data quality problems. So one of the questions, and you need to validate all that. So the best world has good data for all the inputs, but the real world has at least some bad data for almost every decision. How do you fix that? Well, then we have the problem of data input. Does the physician click multiple times to get data in for a decision that he can make, without having to click the data? So we have this sort of human, the socio-technical and the human factor side of this, and the data quality is really a limiting factor. And it's great to have disambiguation data standards so that the data can automatically flow from previous inputs. But the real world gets into trouble, and we have sort of probabilities of the quality of data that we have to deal with.
Yeah, really good point. And yes, I'm not addressing these here. I was basically addressing the other side and providing some legitimacy to the models and their use. But as you correctly point, the data and you talked about the bun. For people, this is the blood urea nitrogen, and John and I had a lot of discussion about the difference between blood urea and bun, specifically blood urea nitrogen. I still don't quite understand the difference because it gets quite chemical, but basically, just to go along the line of what you were saying, in some part of the world we measure it by the number of nitrogen atoms in there. Other part of the world we actually measure the urea itself. So then how do you disambiguate that? So that's why it's really important to make clear which one you're using in your calculation and where does it come from. Now, naturally, any automation or any computer science is under one of the most important rule of computer science, which is garbage in, garbage out. And so naturally, if we don't have correct data, if it's not entered, as you pointed, for the providers and the practitioners, this is a big burden, overload burden. And those are things that I think we're going to start addressing better with the different capture that we have. As I mentioned earlier, right now, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but the state of capture is human capture, human recoding or recapturing the data, and that provides us a posteriori type of data, but just-in-time data is really important. And there's all the notion of time and value. Is this the most recent value? Because it's great to know that Denis weighs 185 pounds. Yeah, that was 20 years ago. I saw Sandy raise her head right away. No, but yeah, but having that in my document doesn't help anybody if it's not a recent value and everything. So there's all kinds of periphery to this to make sure that we do the right thing. But I think it's important that as we start looking at these models, these approach, these standards to capture knowledge, that we go beyond drawing, that we go into a more deeper knowledge, that somebody can argue whether this is correct or incorrect. And then we can look at how it's applied in a particular context. And then we have, how is it applied? Is it a lot of human interaction, or is it using the right data? But
and I agree with you that this model really makes that easier. Of course, there are LOINC codes for those laboratory values, and we know if it's international units or milligrams per deciliter, and so we have defined that. And so the glass is half full and getting fuller.
Another disambiguation level that I didn't bring in here for the audience is all the level of measures and units, because am I 185? My weight is 185. Well, is that in pound or is that in kilogram? And the meaning
definitely
is
not
different.
kilograms. Yeah.
Well, thank you for saving me on that one. Yeah, so it goes to say that deep meaning of things is very important. So beyond doing toys example and showing ideas and how we can build prototype of ideas, if we want to bring this into production, into real use, we got to get serious about semantics.
So we're having an interesting discussion over on Slack, a couple of things about DMN and SBVR and so on. And Derek Myers has asked the question, is it the expectation that everyone will just start to use this combination, and what sort of engagement is needed to really make this change? So do we have to have SBVR there as a necessary part of the disambiguation?
Well, necessary is a big word. It is a possibility, just like, for example, as was mentioned in previous presentation, a lot of people will model everything with BPMN, including decision and case. But we have standards to make this better and have separation of concern. The same can be said, a tool could add all the definition and all this within the DMN model and provide all this, but there is also for that a standard. And I don't see anything right now really lacking in SBVR to achieve what I've tried to present today. So just like I'd like to see people use BPMN, CMMN, and DMN together, I'd like for them to also consider using SBVR. Is this mandatory? Absolutely not. Is this better? That was the argument of my presentation, that I believe it's much better when they are used together.
Right. So James Taylor and Ron Ross over on Slack are discussing some of this. And one of the things that James actually asked Ron, but you might have an opinion on this, is about any plans to separate the vocabulary piece of SBVR from the rules piece. And I don't know if you're actually involved in this, in the standards committees there, or what your thoughts are on separating that.
Well, again, so it is separate in the sense that they're used combined in the spec, and then it becomes a matter of conformance to the spec. But there's nothing stopping you from doing your vocabularies, all your vocabulary and everything according to the SBVR spec, and only have that and not be bothered with creating rules or concept maps. Again, it goes to how much added knowledge you add to this, and that was basically the cumulative arguments that I was making, is that I can have just the vocabulary and it can be serialized in the SBVR format, and then I can have concept maps independent or together, and all this can be done. So there's no obligation unless you're trying to meet a conformance of a specification. So I would argue, just like, hey, a lot of people use only the diagrams of DMN without feel, and nobody questioned that. So why couldn't you use just the vocabularies of SBVR? I think it's knowledge, and it's a way of interchanging between tools, and it's a structured way for us to think about things.
Great. Okay, that's good. Well, thank you very much, Denis. This has been